Welcome to the Filmed Live Musicals podcast, a podcast about stage musicals that have been legally filmed and publicly distributed. The Filmed Live Musicals website contains information on nearly 200 musicals that have been captured live. Check it out at filmedlivemusicals.com. And now, on with the show. Welcome to episode 39 of the Filmed Live Musicals podcast. I'm your host, Louisa Lyons, and today we have a special episode featuring previously unreleased bonus content from our three-part special with historian Margaret Hall, where we talk about the early part of Sondheim's life. Also included are listener testimonials about watching filmed live Sondheim musicals, with words from playwright Caridad Fitch, composer Matt Board, actor John Patrick Sabados, and more. I hope you enjoy this bonus Sondheim episode. So speaking of Stephen Sondheim as a person, let's dive in a little bit into who he was. Can you start us off with a little bit about his childhood and where he grew up and how that relationship between himself and Hammerstein?
Yes. So Steve was born on March 22nd, 1937 in the Upper West Side to a Jewish dress manufacturer and his wife, Janet. Janet was, today the term would be emotionally and psychologically abusive. And by the time Steve was about 10 years old, his father couldn't take it anymore and left the family. And for reasons that are not completely clear to us, Foxy, which is Janet's nickname, decided to move the family to Doylestown, Pennsylvania. Doylestown, Pennsylvania is basically right in the heart of Amish country in Pennsylvania, and actually got a bit of a shout out on the Gilded Age for anyone who might be watching. That is the town that she's coming from in Pennsylvania, and I find it so funny that she's coming from Doylestown. But for reasons we don't completely know historically, because she didn't write it down, she chooses to move Steve to Doylestown. And while there, he befriends James Hammerstein, one of Oscar Hammerstein II's children, and ends up being borderline adopted by the Hammersteins, both because he and Oscar got along incredibly well, and also because the Hammersteins tended to sort of take in children that were being neglected or abused in some fashion, and Steve was being very much neglected and abused by his mother, and so the Hammersteins basically took over. And as Steve was fond of saying, if Oscar had been a geologist, I would have been a geologist. And Steve just sort of started patterning himself off of Oscar Hammerstein II and really pursuing wanting to be like this man who saved him in many regards.
That's when we were talking about this in the course, it's such a devastating story, and yet awful. And beautiful also, because how lucky for musical theater history that Hammerstein was not a geologist, and just the luck of happening to end up in James Hammerstein's class, and
just happening to be
just
there
all
at the
these
right
kind of
time.
strange. Yeah,
I firmly believe that the universe puts us where we're supposed to be. I, as a historian, have read too many of these kind of happenstance coincidences of like, why is Foxy in Doylestown? Oh, because Steve needs to meet Oscar. Where I really do believe, on some level, the universe does that sort of thing.
I can relate to that. Ending up where I have ended up in life, yes.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, when I just look at the path with Paul and I, where it's like, it feels like when I look back at things, it feels like everything directly links. But when I was in it, I had no idea where things were going next.
Yeah, no. So what happens next for Sondheim? He grows up in Doylestown. He's taken under the wing of the Hammersteins. What happens when he comes back to the city?
Yes, so while he's in Doylestown, Hammerstein both takes him on as basically a son and also as a mentee. He teaches him just about everything he knows about the musical theater. He sends Steve to Williams College in Massachusetts, where Steve falls in love with composition, specifically through a couple of teachers, including a man named Milton Babbitt. Listeners, if you want to fall down a rabbit hole, look up Milton Babbitt on Wikipedia. He's a fascinatingly odd figure who deeply influenced Sondheim. And once he graduates from Williams College, he comes to New York and just sort of floats around for a little bit. He does a bunch of odd jobs. He auditions for the $64,000 Question. He's a clapper boy on a film in Australia. He writes a couple of screenplays. And then at one point, when I believe he's 24, he is ushering at a wedding when he meets a man named Lemuel Ayers, who was what I like to call a frustrated impresario, where Lemuel Ayers did a little bit of everything in the theater. He was just trying to find what was the job that was going to stick. And at this point, he had decided he was going to go for producer. He had gotten the rights to an unpublished screenplay by the Epstein brothers called Front Porch and Flatbush, and he had been shopping it around to just about every single composer in the city, many of which did not take the meeting. And the few that did take the meeting basically turned him down. The closest he got to someone saying yes was actually Frank Lesser, which is kind of insane to think about. But Frank Lesser ends up saying no. And he finds out while they're ushering this wedding that Steve is technically a composer lyricist, even if he's not really doing it right now. He's kind of just couch hopping. And he pitches the show to Steve, and Steve basically says, I've got nothing better going on, sure. And that is the show that becomes Saturday Night, or what we now know as Saturday Night. They start developing it. Steve is on track to have his first show on Broadway before he turns 25. He's sort of like high of his life, so excited, and Lemuel is suddenly diagnosed with leukemia and dies before they can get it cast. And the show just falls apart. Funding goes to other places, and the show is just off. And it really is sort of fascinating where what would Sondheim have looked like if his first show had been a show he wrote music and lyrics for at the age of 25 versus what ends up being his first show is West Side Story, which is the show that he writes just lyrics for with Leonard Bernstein. Would you like me to tell the other great sort of happenstance story with that one?
Oh, yes, please.
Yes, okay. So Steve is down in the dumps after Saturday Night. He's so upset that what was going to be this sort of like amazing moment that felt sort of fated to him of like he met Lemuel at this wedding and then it all just sort of fell into place and then suddenly it's fallen apart. And his friend, Bert Shevelov, basically says, I'm taking you to this party because you're too depressed and you need to meet people. Meet me here at 9 p.m. And so Steve goes to this address and Bert's not there at 9 p.m. In fact, he does not show up at the party until about 9:30, 9:45. And Steve was the type of person that at this age, he gets better the older he gets at sort of being an extrovert, but he's very introverted at this stage. And when he goes to parties, he typically sticks with one person. He's the person who will have one really good 1 hour conversation with a person at a party rather than jumping between groups. And so the idea of being at this party where he knows literally no one there, the whole reason Bert was bringing him was so that he was the only person Steve knew and Bert would introduce him to all these other people. Steve walks in and is just sort of blindly looking around the room like, who do I see that I recognize? Who can I sort of attach myself to because I'm in over my head right now? And he sees this man in the back who he sort of vaguely recognizes, and so he goes up to him and starts talking to him and realizes it was one of the book writers they had auditioned for Saturday Night, a man by the name of Arthur Lawrence. And so they start sort of commiserating together. They're similar ages. And they're talking about how both of the shows they're working on aren't working. Saturday Night has fallen apart, and this Romeo and Juliet adaptation that Arthur's been working on, it's not going nowhere. They've lost their lyricists. Betty Comden and Adolph Green were supposed to do it, and they've pulled out because the show's getting too serious for them. And Steve just kind of goes, well, I could do that. I can write lyrics. I write music and lyrics, but I guess I could do just lyrics. And so the two of them, probably a little bit hungover, go to the East Side Story meeting the next day. And Arthur Lawrence introduces Steve to Leonard Bernstein and Jerome Robbins and says he's our new lyricist. I found him at a party last night. Jerome Robbins is not sure about this at first, but Leonard Bernstein's a bit more willing to go with it because he vaguely knew of Steve as being Hammerstein's boy. And so he sort of trusts him on the merit of he trusts Hammerstein. And they work out this agreement where Steve will write additional lyrics to Lenny writing lyrics as well. Steve helps sort of pull the show out of 1910s East Side to, at that point, contemporary late 1950s West Side, he is a big force behind the show, going from being about Jewish and Polish gangs to being about Puerto Rican and Irish gangs. West Side Story happens. It's West Side Story. I'm
A
guessing,
little known musical that
yeah,
people may be familiar with now.
I'm guessing with the caliber of your listeners, I don't need to explain that West Side Story was a hit.
Just
And
a little one, you know.
oh, true, yeah. Listeners, if you're not quite sure what West Side Story is, I'm just going to recommend you maybe pause the podcast, go listen to it, and then come back, because that's just a critical part of your education that you should have.
Yes, and go watch the original movie because it's glorious in its own way, and then watch the new version directed
Yes. Oh,
by
they're so good.
um
As a double billing, they're so good to watch back to back, because it will also tell you so much about how the musical theater has matured in the last 50 years. It's so,
mhm,
yes, very good idea to do a double feature.
yeah.
One of the other sort of fun stories I always like to talk about with West Side Story is the fact that Steve kind of shot himself in the foot with it, which many of us wouldn't think about. He was still credited in the contracts as only writing additional lyrics, even though Leonard Bernstein himself said that Steve wrote basically all the lyrics for West Side Story, aside from a couple of little rhyme things that Leonard Bernstein did to make it match the music he'd written. But like those are like minor tweaks that happen on every show. And Leonard Bernstein flat out offered to change the credit to Steve. Steve did not have to fight for this at all. He was flat out offered to be given the sole lyric credit. And Steve was very touched by that, and he's like, "Oh, great, yeah, we can change it on the marquee. That means so much to me, but like, don't bother calling the lawyers to change it in the contracts. That's too much of a headache." And so he didn't get the adjusted percentage. And Steve probably lost more money on that decision than he made in the next 10 years. It's one of those things where, like, if you could only get in a time machine and tell yourself to stop talking.
Yeah. I'm obsessed with that story. It's so extraordinary, and
It's so good. And
especially
I find that it's
now.
a really good reminder that, like, advocate for yourself and don't undersell yourself. You're worth the money.
Mhm, mhm. And especially now, since he has passed, and just in this past week, the information has come out about the approximate worth of his estate,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea that it could have been even more if he had had that from the beginning, that adjusted credit.
Oh, it would have been very interesting what would have happened with that.
Yeah, yeah. And also fascinating to me, I've heard stories about how Sondheim was kind of resentful of at first having to work with Bernstein,
Yes.
because he wanted to do music and lyrics and
Mhm.
not just be a lyricist in inverted commas. And it's kind of funny to me to think this young kid who is so sure of himself, his abilities, and has such a sense of himself that doesn't come across when he later on says, "No, no, no, it's fine."
Yeah. No, it's one of those things where he felt some type of way before he knew Lenny, because Steve always had this very interesting sense of his own purpose. And he always tried to almost take on more work for himself, which is interesting. He was like the person who would rather do the entire group project by himself because he trusted himself to do it the way it needed to be done. But once he got
We
to
can
know
all
Lenny,
relate.
and he fell in love with Lenny as a friend. They became good friends. That he didn't think of Lenny as like my coworker anymore, like he did when he was first sort of feeling some type of way about West Side Story. By the time this contract conversation is happening, he's Lenny, and he lived with the Bernsteins for a little bit while writing West Side Story. And so it was more like, in the same way that if you're like going out with a stranger and they offer to split the bill at lunch, you're more likely to say, okay, yeah, we'll split the bill, than like if you're out with like a close friend and they're like, okay, so like how much do I owe you? And you're like, oh, don't bother, I got it. I think of it as being that same sort of impulse. Only when we say, "Oh, don't bother, I got it," it's like $15 at Chipotle versus millions of dollars with West Side Story.
That could set you up for life.
Truly.
Again, if only we had a time machine.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's why later on Merrily is so poignant. That ability to go backwards.
Yes, if we can just rewind the tape a little bit. Get the chip.
So rather than rewinding, can we fast forward a little to Gypsy?
Oh, yes. So, Gypsy's another show that Steve does not want to do because he does not want to be pigeonholed as just a lyricist. And I say just by sort of taking the word out of his mouth. Lyricists are
Yeah.
incredibly hard workers, and it's incredibly hard to be a lyricist. Adding the music on top of it is super difficult. So there's no such thing as being just a lyricist. You work incredibly hard if you're a lyricist. But Steve wanted to be doing both. He wanted control of both. And he initially did at the start of Gypsy. It was going to be him and Arthur Lawrence creating it, with David Merrick producing and Ethel Merman starring. But Ethel Merman had had a big flop called Happy Hunting, which he, not which she blamed on the fact that both of the writers were inexperienced. The only success that Steve and Arthur had had up to this point in their careers was West Side Story. And Ethel believed that the success was Jerome Robbins and Leonard Bernstein's and not theirs, and so she considered them untested. And so she basically said that she was not going to do the show unless they brought on a composer that she trusted. She'd let Steve be the lyricist because, okay, he did lyrics for West Side Story, that didn't completely crash and burn, but I want a composer that I can trust. And so David Merrick got a hold of Julie Stein, who I believe had just written Bells Are Ringing, if I've got the timelines correct in my mind, that just won the Tony Award. And so he basically could say, he's on a hot streak. He just wrote a great one. You can't think he's set up for a flop right now. And Steve almost left the project. He really was not happy about this. And he called Oscar Hammerstein II in the way that, like, you would call your father to complain about something. Basically being like, I'm being sort of shortchanged out of the show. I think I'm going to walk when they give me the new contract to sign, and I'll find someone who will let me do it myself. And Oscar sort of talks him off the ledge and goes, well, learning how to write for a star's voice is a really good thing. And you're not going to find a bigger star than Ethel Merman. And then sort of talked to him about the experience that Rodgers and Hammerstein had writing for Mary Martin specifically, and how the roles of Nellie in South Pacific, and at the time the show that Oscar was working on, Marie and the Sound of Music, were really tailored to what Mary Martin could do. And he was basically telling Steve, think of it like an assignment. You're learning how to write for Ethel Merman. And you're going to be busy enough trying to figure that out with just lyrics. Let Julie handle the music. You can always do it later. And so Steve was sort of cajoled into doing Gypsy, which of course then goes on to be Gypsy, which is what I consider one of the permanently revivalable shows. To me, there's something called revival fatigue, where like you can only really revive most shows every 15 years or so. Gypsy has had a major revival on Broadway every single decade since its production. And I still don't think people are tired of it. We had two in the 2000s. And people are still, they just
Who do you
want more
think will be
Gypsy.
next?
Oh,
Who's the next
who do I
Mama
think will
Rose?
be next, or who do I want is the real question.
Let's hear both.
What I want is LaShawne's.
Yes.
I want a production starring her and her daughter Celia.
Yes.
It would rip the roof off, I think. I can so clearly picture how good LaShawne's Rose's Turn would be. I need it.
Yes, and
There,
Celia would be
it would
amazing.
be so good. I feel like it adds something to the dynamic of the fact that, like, in reality, LaShawne's and Celia are like a healthy stage mother situation, where Celia fell in love with the industry through her mother being in the industry. And then just to see them playing sort of like the twisted side of the coin of that, I'd be so interested to see that. It's sort of like how in
Yes.
my dreamscape, I really wish we got a Gypsy with Judy Garland and Liza Minnelli.
Oh, don't toy with my affections in that way.
But like in my dreamscape, I like to think that that happened and that the Judy name happened.
Oh, it hurts to think
I know.
about.
I know. No, I have a giant painting of Judy Garland in my office because she just I wanted so much more, and yet she gave us so much. But in terms
So
of
much.
productions that I think actually might happen, the Audra McDonald one has been rumored for the last decade, but the last I heard about it, Scott Rudin owned the rights to that option, so who knows where that's at. There were rumors for a while of the Imelda Staunton UK production transferring, but I have a feeling that's probably not happening at this point because they made the film of it and because I think post-pandemic Imelda's moved on to other ideas.
Yeah, that
But
makes sense.
frankly, it's one of those things where every musical theater actress I know of over the age of 30 wants to play Rose. She's like the King Lear of the musical theater canon. So frankly, I would love to just see like a repertory production of Gypsy that's just like moved into the Broadway. Like, pick a Broadway theater that typically does not have long-term tenants. We just decide that this is the Gypsy Theater, and every 6 months a new cast comes in. I would love to just see that, or something of that, where it's like just gypsies here and we just everyone gets their chance, because I want to see everyone's version, because Rose is such a rich role and the way that Steve wrote it is so rich, especially when paired with Arthur Lawrence's book. You can do so much with it, and I want to see everyone's interpretations.
And then let's film them all and have our box set of Gypsy. Thank
Yes.
you.
Oh my gosh, yes. And it can start with the Bette Midler.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yes. The my childhood right there.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That's her. Some people specifically is like imprinted on my mind when she's in that little kitchen.
Oh my God. I remember being terrified of her in that role. Like, I remember being genuinely frightened
Yeah.
of, yeah, she's terrifying. Absolutely brilliant.
Hmm.
Okay. I we're getting a little low on time,
Okay.
so this is gonna be a speed through
Yes. Let's go.
of Sondheim. So let's jump ahead to a funny thing happened on the way to the forum.
Yes. So this is Steve's attempt to break the pattern, because he decided that if he does 3 shows just lyrics in a row, no one will ever hire him for music. So he's like, I have to break it before 3 is the curse. And so he writes A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum with Burt Shevelov, the friend previously mentioned, who sort of inadvertently got him on West Side Story. And the show is a hit, but the reviews almost universally pan Steve's music, which is kind of insane to me. It's one of the only times a musical wins the Tony Award for Best Musical with the score not even being nominated. And it's one of the only times Steve's score is not nominated at the Tonys, let alone not win.
Devastating.
Truly.
And like crushing for Sondheim
And
to
especially for someone who's
finally.
trying to get people to let him write music, that's not boding well for them being like, okay, you need to go back to doing just the lyrics.
I will say, historically, the Tonys have not always made the correct decisions.
Oh, yes. But I just feel like this is a
So,
particular failure on their part.
yes. Let's jump ahead to one of my recent favorite discoveries. I'm working on it with my chorus, where the Master Voices will be performing Anyone Can Whistle at Carnegie Hall in March.
Oh, yay!
And I'm so excited because it's such a bizarre and fascinating show.
Oh my gosh, it's a weird one. It's in like the upper echelon of weird Sondheim, and you know that there's competition for it. Anyone Can Whistle was Arthur Lawrence and Steve coming together basically to be like, we're gonna write a show together, and then no one can say that it was a success because of other people. And then it closes in 9 performances. Those are sort of like the big bullet points that you need to remember about it. It also was written for Angela Lansbury, who is a gem and a half, and it really, really disheartened Steve and sort of shook his foundations of feeling like, well, maybe I can't write music. Maybe I am just a lyricist, and sort of having that sort of crisis of faith in his own talent.
And the score is so it's I feel like there are standout numbers from it
Mm-hmm.
that people know, like there won't be
Oh, for
trumpets,
sure.
and what's the other one that everybody does all the time?
I mean, I don't know about
Um
your friends, but all my friends do the "Everyone Hates Me." Yes, yes,
yes,
that one.
yes.
I forget what it's called.
It's the opening number.
Yeah, and then people
Um
also do the title track. Anyone Can Whistle.
mhm. And at, I'm am I right in remembering that Hammerstein passes away
Hammerstein passes right
during or
before A
just
Funny Thing
before
Happened on
that?
the Way to the Forum. So right
Mhm.
as Steve is starting to be like, people are not like receiving my music the way I want them to, he suddenly doesn't have Oscar to turn to be like, I'm telling you that your music is good. He suddenly doesn't
Mm.
have that, and he's also dealing with the fact that when Oscar passed away, he had sort of inadvertently told Steve to take care of Richard Rodgers and told Richard Rodgers to take care of Steve. And both of them misconstrue it in the same way. I don't think this is the way that Oscar meant it when he said that. I think he meant it as like, you guys are family and you need to make sure that the two of you make it through this loss together. But the way that they end up taking it is, I guess Steve is supposed to replace Oscar Hammerstein and we will be writing together now. And that is how we get Do I Hear a Waltz, one of the only
Mhm.
regrets Steve had in his entire career. And if you listen to the show, you can hear it. Like, Steve's lyrics are fighting with Richard Rodgers' music. The two of them nearly came to blows several times, and it pretty much single handedly ended the collaboration between Sondheim and Arthur Lawrence because he just kept putting gasoline on the fire of the fight between Rodgers and Sondheim. And Steve was like, well, I can't deal with that anymore. And so they split as well, and Steve became his own sort of independent unit after Do I Hear a
Mm,
Waltz, which again, Steve, like, he's pretty brutal about it if you read his books, where he's just like, if I could erase one thing from my career, it's that misstep. But the one good
mm.
thing that came out of Do I Hear a Waltz is it affirmed for Steve, it's like, yep, I am never being just a lyricist again. I don't care if no one likes my music. I refuse to do this again.
And then we have the very quirky but delightful and slightly now problematic Evening Primrose,
Yes. Evening
the
Primrose,
TV
it's a
for TV.
television thing. You can find it on YouTube, good people of the page. It's a very weird show. Mannequins come to life. Anthony Perkins is a writer who decides to move into a mall, but it has some of my favorite Sondheim ballads in it.
Mm.
There is some
I
beautiful stuff
remember
in there.
it's so
Oh,
beautiful, and
it's
the
stunning.
the haunting poetry of it is
Oh,
just stunning.
whenever I need a good cry, I put on Laura Benante's performance of that from Sondheim's 90th birthday concert because it's just so beautiful.
Yes, yes. And fast forwarding a little more
Mhm.
to into the 1970s to Company.
Company. This is the start of the Prince Sondheim era, which, when your listeners think of Sondheim, they're probably thinking of this era. Unless they're a Sunday in the Park with George diehard, they're probably thinking of a Prince and Sondheim show. And he and Prince had been sort of circling each other for a while. They had first met at the opening night party of South Pacific. Steve was there as the guest of Oscar Hammerstein II. Hal was there as the guest of George Abbott, who, if you don't know who George Abbott is, one of the most influential producers and directors in the history of the musical theater. Hal was kind of his assistant, kind of his gopher. And the two had become good friends, and they used to sort of meet and have lunch together and talk about all the ways they wanted to change the musical theater for the better, because they loved it so much and they wanted to sort of be these movers and shakers in it, and Company was their first big swing at doing that together. Prince had broken off from the Abbott office and created the Prince office, and they decided to create what people call the concept musical. Although, as you know, I don't really agree with that term because I think all shows have a concept. I think it's better defined as a plotless musical, where the plot is not the purpose. The purpose of the show is maybe the personalities or the theme the things center around. Company starts as a song cycle, a plot is eventually scaffolded through it, but the purpose of Company is not really to be like, let's talk about all the specifics of what Bobby's going through. It's more to meditate on the idea of marriage and the idea of commitment and what that means in all of its different ways. And Company ends up being a pretty big success at its time. It's currently revived on Broadway right now. It's one of his most staged Prince Sondheim productions because there's so much you can do with it. Because of how the plot is scaffolded through, you can reinvent it in so many different ways.
Mm. And it is the 2011 New York Philharmonic production is one of my favorite pro shots of
Oh,
all time.
yes.
It's the reason I started this website.
Ah.
It's there was an interview when I saw the screening of that capture in London
Mhm.
when I was doing my master's. Ellen Krass, the producer, had this pre-taped interview
Mm.
before the screening, and she talked about she'd had trouble getting funding for taping because no one had heard of filming a musical.
Mhm.
And I was like, hold up.
Wait a
I grew
second.
up watching Into the Woods on VHS. Why haven't these people heard of filming a musical? And so I wrote my thesis on it and then
Ah.
built an entire website around
Yes,
it.
and I'm so glad you have. And that company, 2011, music directed by Mr. Paul Gimignani himself.
It all comes together. Look at that. And I want to I know I'm speeding through here,
It's all
but I
right.
want to get us to Pacific Overtures,
Yes.
and then we'll stop at Pacific
Mhm.
Overtures. So let's jump over to Follies.
Yes, I'll do Follies and a Little Night Music in quick succession.
Beautiful.
Follies is Hal Prince's big swing. Company is Steve's big swing at sort of redefining what a musical can be. He's taking aspects of a show called Allegro, written by Oscar Hammerstein, and reinventing it to create what is colloquially called the concept musical. I will use that term begrudgingly. Follies is Hal Prince's big swing of basically trying to reinvent the idea of the Ziegfeld Follies for a modern audience in terms of like this big like event theater type of situation. It's extremely expensive. It is at the time the second most expensive musical ever staged, only narrowly edged out by Coco, which opened the same season. And the only reason it is edged out is because of Lauren Bacall's salary. So if we actually wait, is it Lauren Bacall or is it Katharine Hepburn?
Katharine Hepburn.
Katharine Hepburn, only narrowly edged out by Katharine Hepburn's salary. So if we take salaries out and we're just talking about the cost of sets, costumes, crew labor, Follies is far and away the more expensive. It costs over $800,000 at the time, which to us now we're just like, that's like lower than the cheapest play you can do on Broadway today, but at the time that was insane. And because of how high the operating costs are, Follies has to close pretty quick just because they have no sort of cushion to land on to find their audience. And so A Little Night Music comes about. It's Steve's only real true adaptation, in my opinion. He fully reinvents the rest of them, but this is a fairly standard reinvention of one of Steve's favorite films by Ingmar Bergman, which both comes along because Steve wants to play with the idea of developing one motif across an entire score. In the case of A Little Night Music, it's every single song is written in waltz time or 3/4 time, but it also is intentionally sort of done as this is a safer show to do after Follies because we really need to make money right now. And so, what is a show that audiences will see? Because this sort of experimental endeavor of ours is going to end before it's really begun if we don't get in the black right now. And so, A Little Night Music is what sort of refills that cup. And then we get to Pacific Overtures, which is Steve saying, okay, the cup's full. Now let's completely dump it out.
So I have a series of questions that I ask all my guests. There are no wrong answers. You don't need to think about it too much. Whatever comes to mind is good. So to start off with, what is your favorite musical?
Assassins.
As we have previously established,
Yes.
do you have a favorite filmed live musical?
Ooh. It might be Pacific Overtures. I've watched
Mm.
that tape a lot since writing Gemignani, and it's become my second favorite Sondheim show. But if I'm thinking of a pro shot that is not a Sondheim pro shot, this is a little controversial of me. But it is the American in Paris pro shot because that show was really important to me my senior year of high school, my freshman year of college. And while the pro shot does not have my dearly beloved Max von Essen in the role of Henri, it does capture Robbie Fairchild and Leanne Cope's incredible ballets. So for that reason alone, I revisit it a lot.
There is a whole discussion to be had there about Broadway shows transferring to the West End and being filmed in the West End and not Broadway.
Oh yeah, we
Although
can get
American in
really
Paris
into the
started in
numbers of
Paris,
that.
but there's a whole thing there. But why do you say controversial?
Controversial just because I've got a lot of friends in the American in Paris community and we're all very loyal to that Broadway cast.
Got it. Got it. It
But
is a
I
stunning capture, though.
yes. Oh, it's a stunning capture and the way they film the dances just moves me. Again, I do not have dance talent, but ballet like gets me in the heart spot when I watch it.
That
And
feels,
the
yeah.
way that they film the dance sequences I think is really well done. I think there are some times in pro shots where they just kind of set up a static camera and just film the dance, but the way that they almost choreograph the camera to move around them as they're dancing is just stunning.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Filmed live musicals aren't exactly stage shows and they're not
Mhm.
exactly films. So, what should we call them? You used the word pro shot just now, but do you have
Yes.
any other term that we should use?
So I use pro shot when it's like a filming of a piece that's typically on stage. But to me there I you also I would consider something that would be a filmed live musical would be something like say Star Kid.
Oh, yes,
The
absolutely.
shows by Team Star
Hmm.
Kid, where those are not really pro shots. If you take the word pro shot, it means professionally shot. A Harry Potter musical is filmed on, I believe, someone's digital camera stuck to a seat in the back of the theater, if I remember correctly. So I wouldn't really call that a professional shot, but it's a shot and it's a filmed live musical.
Hmm.
I guess the term for me would be sort of captured theater. probably, where you're capturing something about the theater. It's not the same as making a movie adaptation. But they're also, it's not digital theater either, which I've seen some people apply, because to me digital theater is its own thing where it's built to be for the digital platform. And that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about trying to capture the ephemeral nature of theater. And so I think captured theater sort of covers that in my mind.
Oh, I love that. And that has to be one of the most considered responses I've ever had to that question.
Well, thank you.
Normally people like look at me in absolute panic. So love, love, love that answer. Where do you stand on bootlegs?
You're gonna get me in trouble, Louisa. I think that they are an incredibly valuable historical tool for preservation, and we would have no footage of many performances had people not bootlegged them. However, I would love for them to become obsolete. And the only way that they will become obsolete is if producers take it upon themselves to create captured theater of their own. If they don't, then the only way that a lot of these performances can live on is in bootlegs. And so long as producers are making that choice, I don't think bootlegs will go away. Do I think bootleggers should distract from performances and distract performers? In no way, shape, or form. However, I do think that a lot of the backlash that they get tends to be outsized. But also, I'm not going to be taking in a digital camera myself. I will, however, write a producer and tell them that they need to let the theater on film and tape archive in.
Hmm.
That's sort of my stance on it, where it's like, what I would love is I would love for bootlegs to be a thing of the past, not because they stop recording theater, but because the industry itself steps up to the plate and fills this demand that there clearly is.
Louder for the people in the back. Yes. What stage musicals do you wish had been filmed?
Oh my god, so many, but the one at the top of my head having talked is Follies. Oh my god, what I would give to see
The
the
original Broadway
original,
production?
like, extravagant, all the money on the stage staging that Hal Prince did of Follies. It's one of my time machine shows of, like, I so wish I could just sit there and analyze every second of it.
Did you see the National Theatre production?
I did, yes, and it's fantastic. But I feel like there's just something specific about the way that Hal Prince was extra in
Hmm.
1971 that is just not touchable.
Yeah. What would you like to see filmed in the future?
In the future, hmm, that's a good question. Well, I'd love for the pieces of the Sondheim canon that have not been captured to be captured in some capacity. I'd love for there to one day be like a box set where you could buy the works of Stephen Sondheim, and it's every single one of the musicals, different productions, things like that. I think we currently have like 60% of them recorded already. So it's just
Yeah.
I'd love to fill in those gaps.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Like, Anyone Can Whistle is
Mhm.
one. Um,
Assassins, wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
yes. Oh, I'm so sad that the classic stage, CSC.
Yeah, I'm so
Yes.
sad they
Oh,
closed as
I'm
well, but I
so, so
am
sad they
glad that
closed.
they're making the safe choice. And I'm
Yes.
glad to
Oh,
see producers
absolutely.
who are sort of making that call. That makes me feel good about their company, and especially about supporting. I'm going to be going to see A Man of No Importance when they do that later this season, and that
Mm.
just as an audience member, it makes me feel so much safer to know that they're taking this truly seriously.
Oh, absolutely. And maybe they have some archival footage or enough B-roll footage that they could release a little something something.
Please, please, Mr.
uh
John Doyle.
por favor. Where can we find you online? And where
Yes,
can we pre-order your fabulous book?
ooh, yes. So Jim and Yanni, Life and Lessons from Broadway and Beyond can be pre-ordered at all book retailers. I recommend that if you have a local bookstore that you really like, that you can support them by having them order a copy specifically for you through my publishers, Applause Theater and Cinema Books. However, it also is at all the big boxes, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, Amazon, all that jazz. You can find it there. In terms of finding me outside of just Jim and Yanni, my website is margaret-hall.com. That's where you can find information about everything I'm working on, including articles, forthcoming books, podcast appearances. You can also find information on my teaching and my newsletter there, and you can contact me directly through my website. And you can also contact me and find me at the handle It's Margaret Hall on Twitter and Instagram. I use Twitter much more than I use Instagram. Go to Instagram if you want to see me talk about Twilight and my friends, But if you want to see me talking about musical theater, Twitter's where you want to find me. I'm on there just about every day.
Wonderful. And we will have links to all of those in the show notes. Margaret, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
It's been so lovely to be here.
Shortly after Stephen Sondheim passed away in November last year, I did a call out on Twitter for people to share their memories of watching filmed live Sondheim musicals. I received responses from around the world, including Mike Bryant in New Zealand, who stated, I watched pro shots of Sondheim shows because in New Zealand, we don't get access to a lot of big Broadway shows any other way. They've also helped me show people what makes musical theater so good, because all people want to put on over here is Grease. No shade to Grease.
And Lauren Dotson, who shared,
When I was in the 5th grade, I was homesick from school, and PBS had been on the TV all day. After the animated shows went off, there was a showing of great performances, and this one was a film performance of Sondheim's Company with Neil Patrick Harris. At that point, I'd only been in school musicals that were based off of Disney movies, so when I was watching Company, I was very confused but oh so captivated. It's like this world of music and performance was opened up for me, and it showed me how mature and meaningful art, and more specifically theater, can be. So thank you to Sondheim, and thank you to PBS. And thank you, Lauren, for sharing your story. To round out our Stephen Sondheim special, you'll hear from playwright Caridad Svich and composer Matt Board and their thoughts on Sunday in the Park with George, and actor John Patrick Savados about why Sondheim pro shots are incredibly vital.
Hi, this is Caridad Svich. I'm thinking about Sunday in the Park with George by Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine, probably because I saw it in person the first time, the original cast, and was extraordinarily moved by it and was desperate to see it again. But I couldn't afford the tickets. And so when recorded version was on PBS, it was just such a gift. And I remember wanting to feel the same feelings I had when I saw it live. And obviously that's impossible. But also wanting to figure out the play, figure out the show more. So I think that the element that attracted me to watching the pro shot was that in a way I could deconstruct the piece as I was watching it in a way that I felt I couldn't when I saw it live. And also, I had a very, I wouldn't say negative, but I had a kind of unsatisfied feeling about the second act of the show. Because I felt the first act ends in that sort of the big number of Sunday, and there's a kind of just overwhelming rush of emotion. And the second act is very cool. You know, it has if the first act has a kind of heat about it, as it were, even within its distance, the second act is about coolness. It really is about coolness. It's about like networking and being an artist and in the modern world and Chromaloom. And so I just remember finding it all a bit, what is this, you know? And so, but then when I saw it, the recorded version, I had a very different reaction to the second act. It actually made more sense. I felt less of a disconnect than I did when I saw it live. Or maybe I should say that it felt less jarring than when I saw it live. I was also able to see the details of those performances as well as the details of the staging in a different way and appreciate them even more. The precision, the control, the clarity of the work, but also the incredible passion running underneath the show, which I think is something that, I mean, it should not be surprising by now, but I think that Sondheim, by and large, over his very, very long, incredible career, there was this reaction to his work, especially from critics, that seemed to say, oh, the work is very intellectual, it's very cerebral, as a sort of negation of emotion. Like, when is Stephen going to make us cry? You know, I think seemed to be the undercurrent of a lot of the reviews. And while I think that Sunday in the Park with George is a piece that is incredibly emotional. Hence, people weeping at the end of that first act and sections of the second. I think that the work still gets labeled around or gets treated as a piece that is about somebody being very cerebral and trying to be emotional. And I think that, all to say is that when I saw the Pro Shot, I actually was able to kind of, this is very ironic because it was recorded, right? So, but I was able to appreciate the incredible passion underneath the work, and feel it maybe even more palpably than I did live in the room with the material. So, yeah, it's very strange. I also will say that I love just the ability to have it in my hands. I think that's one of the things about Pro Shots in particular, whether you've seen the show live originally or you're going to see it, that there is this feeling of it, of literally like holding a record. So I have seen other live productions of this musical, and for some reason I keep coming back to the recorded version, both the actual recording, like the cast recording, the record, as a listener, but also the recorded version on film, the Pro Shot, as we call it. Oh yeah, and I think that there's something. It's such a gift, I think, to be able to hold it in your hands, or to feel like you can apprehend it, and study it. I think it's a great tool of study as well, and not just a consumerist experience that I think makes Pro Shots really exciting. I think for the field. So yeah, those are some thoughts. Thinking about my ongoing love of Sunday in the Park with George and the emotion I feel when I think about that show, and even sometimes when I'm just literally when I'm thinking about it, that I get emotional about it. I think because it is about art making, but it's also about being in the world and being an artist in the world and having to understand how to do that when sometimes all you want to do is be with your art. But the fact that only way that your art grows and deepens is by being in the world. So it's a piece that speaks to the paradox and the heart of being an artist in a very complex way.
Hello, my name is Matt Board, and I'm a composer from Woking. That's a little town just outside of London in the UK. So I discovered Sondheim as a teenager in the 90s, and I very quickly realized from hearing his work that he was who I wanted to be when I grew up. But back then, his shows weren't as widely produced. The cast albums were really tricky to get hold of because there wasn't such a thing as Amazon yet. You had to scour your local record shop or go to a CD fair and just hope that one would turn up. And as far as finding a published libretto of one of his shows, forget about it. So the pro shoots of his shows on Broadway, available on VHS, and the extremely rare late night TV broadcast, if you read the listings carefully enough, they were the only way I'd ever get to see the full shows. Not just hear the songs, but get to see and understand how they fitted in within the dialogue, within the scenery, within the whole ebb and flow of the theatrical evening. I just wanted to learn as much as I could from that man's work at a time when seeing it live in performance was a very distant and remote opportunity. For example, my favourite show of his is Sunday in the Park with George, for a number of reasons. Personally, I think that the original cast has never been surpassed. I adore the original Broadway cast recording, and I'm gutted that I never got to see James Lapine's original production at Playwrights Horizons or when it was running on Broadway. I never got to see that live and in person, but thanks to the pro shoot, I got the next best thing. I got to see it nonetheless. I love pro shoots for all these reasons and more.
Hi, this is John Patrick Sabatis. I'm a New York-based actor born and raised in Brooklyn. I saw my first Broadway musical when I was 9 years old, and it was Phantom of the Opera. Not long after this, my oldest sister, seeing that I had caught the theater bug, took it upon herself to introduce me to the wonderful world of Stephen Sondheim by way of the filmed Broadway performance of Into the Woods. This started a teasing back and forth between my sister and myself regarding the level of artistry of these two composers, which lasts to this day, with her describing Andrew Lloyd Webber as overblown melodrama and me referring to Sondheim as pretentious drivel. Now, neither of us actually feels this way about either composer, but this teasing bonded us in our love of musical theater and has expanded my theatrical encyclopedia. While I will confess that I didn't immediately appreciate, love, and adore Into the Woods the way I do today, given that I was a preteen and also that I didn't want to give my sister the satisfaction, it was most definitely the gateway into the world of Mr. Sondheim. A world that is ever expanding as I see and have the opportunity to perform in more of his shows. Together, my sister and I have seen a few live performances of Into the Woods, including the last Broadway revival starring Vanessa Williams. It's awfully bizarre, all these years later, to have actually performed on the same stage as Ms. Williams in the recent Master Voices presentation of Sondheim's Anyone Can Whistle. Life definitely does seem to have a way of bringing things back around. From Into the Woods, I moved on to catching the filmed Broadway performances of Sweeney Todd and Sunday in the Park with George on TV, both of which I had vastly different responses to, again, watching them in my preteen and early teen years. But what I love about Stephen's shows and the fact that a good chunk of his theatrical work is available on film is that you can watch them over and over again and hear something new, learn something new, and experience something new each time. And it can speak to you in a different way depending upon where you are in your life. I have a completely different appreciation of Sunday in the Park with George than I did when I first watched it. And I was so excited to see the most recent revival with Jake Gyllenhaal and Anna Lee Ashford. And I would even argue that having access to recorded performances only intensifies my desire to experience the show live whenever a production comes around. Now, while Into the Woods was my first experience and will always, always, always have a special place in my heart, I'd probably have to say my favorite filmed stage performance of one of Stephen's shows is New York City Opera's production of A Little Night Music starring Regina Resnick, George Lee Andrews, and Sally Ann Howes. I was introduced to this performance in college by my history of musical theater professor, Elwood Anaheim, and I am forever grateful because moments like Regina artfully and effortlessly singing Liaisons and Sally heartbreakingly singing Send in the Clowns still give me chills and move me to tears. And I probably watch it at least once a year. These filmed performances are such a gift. They are masterclasses in music and acting and artistry. They are singular moments captured and are never to be repeated or recreated. And they have and will continue to inspire artists for generations and really highlight the crux of Stephen's work, our humanity. Thank God for the gift of Stephen Sondheim, and thank God for these recordings that preserve his brilliance and his artistry and these beautiful moments that we get to continue to experience.
With thanks to the wonderful Margaret Hull for sharing her extensive musical theatre knowledge, make sure to take a listen to our 3-part series on Sondheim, featuring deep dives into the Pacific Overtures and company with the New York Philharmonic. Thank you also to listeners Kari Dudsvich, Matt Board, John Patrick Sabados, Mike Bryant, and the Lauren Renaissance for sharing your Sondheim stories. The Filmed Live Musicals podcast is created and edited by your host, Louisa Lyons, with thanks to our wonderful patrons, Josh Brandon, Geraldine Brewer, Belinda Broido, Elliot Charles, Gillian Dos Santos, Rachel Esteban, Mercedes Esteban Lyons, Rusty Fox, David Jones, James T. Lane, Alison Matthews, Al Monaco, David Negrin, Amy Penn, Gerald Piper, Jesse Rabinowitz and Brenda Goodman, David and Catherine Rabinowitz, Joe Tillotson, and Beck Twist for financially supporting the site. FilmedLiveMusicals.com is the most comprehensive list of film stage musicals. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you would like early access to this very podcast, early access to site content, the full weekly newsletter with info on upcoming streams, and exclusive access to the streaming calendar, become a Filmed Live Musicals patron for as little as $3 a month. And if you're outside the US, you can sign up in your local currency. Visit FilmedLiveMusicals.com to learn more. If you like what you hear, please leave a review through the Rate This Podcast link in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thanks for listening.